We are moving into Chapter 8, our chapter on emotional behavior disorders. This is the acronym for this would be EBD. And as we move through this material, you might find some interesting things that might maybe conflict a little bit with some of your own personal convictions or ideas, or what you think should or shouldn't be diagnosed as an emotional behavior disorder. And that's perfectly understandable. This is a controversial disorder, even in secular circles. However, it is a disorder in the public school system that is rising in prevalence. Therefore, it is something that you need to be aware of and understanding of so that you are able to interact with your colleagues and your students in a professional way, regardless of maybe what you personally think about it. You know, society's beliefs about the causes and cures of mental disturbances, you know, they've always followed the broader trends of the times, basically. So early history shows that people that were children even that had problem behaviors, had mental disturbances, often they were believed to be possessed by the devil, or they were believed to be, you know, clinically insane. In fact, in the late 1800s, children who were different like this, mentally or behaviorally, were often placed in special class assignments. Their treatment was left over to medical personnel. So they weren't educated, if you will. They were basically test subjects in medical facilities, insane asylums, and things like that. Itard and Seguin were some of the first French scientists that began working with children and treating children with these kinds of disabilities. And you know, at that time there was no distinguishment between EBD and IDD. So Itard and Seguin worked with children across the board in these areas. So after World War II, then the responsibility shifted for these children shifted from the mental health or the medical health professionals to educators. And now you're going to see children, rather than in insane asylums and, you know, hospitalized, you're going to see them more intertwined and interwoven into the school fabric, actually in the classrooms. So as we become aware then of the power of environmental, social factors that actually influence children's development, we also then understand treatment better, and we're also able to improve our educational environment, our social environment, so on and so forth, to help these children make better gains in the classroom. So we're focusing on EBD because this is something that you are going to see. You are going to interact with it. It is not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So you need to be aware of what EBD is, what it looks like, and how you as a teacher could potentially help, frankly. I want us to consider two types of students that you will see in your classroom at some point. We've got a Jim and we've got a Molly. So the two common types of these students, these two types of students might be suspected of having an EBD, but they look very different. So Jim, he's loud, he's disruptive, he's defiant. Molly is quiet. She kind of quietly determines that she's not going to do her work. She just shakes her head no. She doesn't make any loud verbal defiance. She's just a quiet defender, if you will. So Jim is very loud and he is disruptive. Molly is very quiet and she's not disruptive. However, both of these students are two common types of students that you would find in a classroom that could be potentially diagnosed or suspected of having an emotional behavior disorder. Well, both of these students, I failed to mention to you, are also failing academically speaking. Do they have EBD? Or are they just lazy? Do they need some kind of specific discipline? The problem we have when I have students like these two in my classroom is I have 28 other students that I need to give attention to. where do I give attention and how do I divide myself up to help both Jim and Molly and my other 28 students? Where do I focus my efforts and my energies? Do I focus less on Jim and Molly and then more on the struggling students who actually care about learning? Or do I really put all my eggs in, Jim and Molly's baskets and really, pour myself into them to the detriment of the other 28? How do I help with this? Well, let's consider a little bit more here. What if you learned from Jim's bus driver that Jim sits alone? He cries quietly to himself on the bus. This happens both to and from school several times a week. Does this information change your mind maybe about your initial reaction to Jim and your commitment to him? Why or why not? Is it possible that Molly's behavior doesn't include laziness, but rather some more serious issue? And I would contend that yes. Often our initial reactions as teachers, before we kind of dig in and we understand the entire history of a student's situation, our initial reaction might be negative, or it might be, well, I'm just going to fix this problem, without getting the entire bout of information. Some behaviors are certainly indicators of a child in need. Now, I use that word some on purpose because not all behaviors are indicators of children in need. I would say that potentially Jim and Molly could be students in need here. There might be a situation that there's more than meets the eye here. And if I can determine the why this student is engaging in these difficult behaviors, then I might be able to find a solution to be able to address those negative behaviors that I want to change in the classroom. And obviously, I want both Jim and Molly to be completing their work. I want them to be moving through the general education curriculum. Their behaviors are impeding their progress in the general education curriculum, which then is going to impede their academic goals and might get them behind, and this is going to be problematic. So I share Jim and Molly with you on purpose to help you understand and maybe put a face on what EBD could look like in your classroom. You see, generally speaking, there are reasons why students misbehave in the classroom. There are purposes behind their unsatisfactory behavior, if you will. And now, again, this does not list all the reasons why, but generally speaking, when we're talking about kids who are misbehaving because some kind of a need in themselves is not being met, it's because of one of these reasons. Maybe they're trying to gain social attention, or they're trying to gain some kind of a tangible or even an activity that they want to do. Sometimes they want to get out of doing something, or they want to delay or even reduce or avoid something that is considered unpleasant to them. They might want to escape people, like get away from people. And some students do things because they have some compulsion or an internal satisfaction in doing these negative behaviors. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a couple of slides. So as you consider the purpose above, let's talk about Jim and Molly then. They're students in need here. Why might Jim be displaying negative behavior? Which of these purposes might explain Jim? Well, I think it could be maybe one or two of these. I think one of them is maybe Jim is trying to gain social attention, whether it be from the teacher or from his peers, but maybe he gets negative attention at home and he's seeking some kind of a positive social attention. Who knows? Or maybe Jim is really trying to get out of something that he doesn't enjoy, or maybe something that he not necessarily doesn't enjoy, maybe something that's laborious for him, or it's difficult for him and he wants to avoid it. He doesn't want to he feels stupid, or like he can't do it. How about Molly? Well, Molly might be doing her behaviors, again, because she wants to get out of the unpleasant task, or she might be trying to escape the teacher, or escape her friends, or whatever. Okay, so looking at the purposes sometimes helps us to be able to address negative behavior in the classroom. Now, I will tell you this: when you get to classroom management in a couple of years, we will actually walk through this process in detail. You will learn how to curb negative behavior by trying to figure out the why of what students do and then addressing the why in a positive way. And we'll talk about all of that in great detail in classroom management. So first of all, we do need to define emotional behavior disorder. Okay, what exactly is it? Well, defining EBD is very, very tricky. There's no clear dividing line on any assessment. Like, for example, IDD has that clear dividing line of, they have an IQ of 70 or below. Well, we don't have anything like that with EBD. Many of the problems that are experienced by children with EBD are also problems that are experienced by typically developing children, as you're going to find out, okay? But the difference is the key here. The difference is it's not the kind of behavior that we're talking about. It's actually rather the intensity and the duration of the behavior that defines EBD. So yes, we're going to be talking about some things that actually are descriptive of any student in the classroom at different times, depending upon what's going on in their lives. The difference between kids with EBD is that these characteristic traits are longer lasting and they're more intense. They're very in the classroom. Okay, so they last over a long period of time and to a marked degree, and it adversely impacts their educational performance. There's that little component there. A child cannot be, diagnosed with an EBD that qualifies for special ed unless they have an adverse impact on their educational performance in the classroom. So EBD, says things like an inability to learn that cannot be explained by other some other kind of a disorder. Okay, so they're not learning, but there's not another disorder that can explain it. An inability to build and maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with their peers and with their teachers. This is a real strong component when we are defining EBD. Inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances. So something regular happens in the classroom and your child with EBD is going to act in a very unusual way, or a way that is not typical of other students, or they might represent very strong feelings that under normal circumstances, typical children wouldn't react in such a way. Often they have a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, and they have a tendency also to develop symptoms, physically speaking, so psychosomatic symptoms or fears that are associated with school problems. So these are your children that have, belly aches and they don't go to school. One of the problems that, with this definition with EBD is that this is all suggesting that the disorder is actually something that's within the child himself or herself. The only problem with this is the reality of EBD, as we're going to talk about as we go on, is that the environment of a child is often a hugely important factor. It's not just something that's going on inside of the child, although there are genetic components and seems to be some biological factors, yes. Often the environment seems to be the overarching real turning point for these kids. So something to be considered. Another problem with the federal definition of EBD is the caveat that the term emotional behavior disorder does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted unless it is determined that they have an emotional disturbance. So, some educators, some professionals actually feel like it's really impossible to separate maladjustment and emotional disturbance. And I would agree with that. However, this is what the federal definition says, so this does not apply to children who are socially maladjusted. So what is social maladjustment then? Well, social maladjustment is behavior that conflicts with society in general, but it's often adaptive behavior. So they often, it seems to indicate or imply that the child has a choice in doing this behavior. So it's like the student's behavior is intentionally antisocial or willful in delinquency. And they often have very low fear and low inhibition in the acting out of that behavior. And often, frankly, low remorse in that regard. So often students who are maladjusted are retaliatory. They are revengeful, if you will. They're very goal-oriented in getting that revenge or getting even with people. They often will use negative behaviors to maintain or even gain some kind of peer status or even a deviant status. Students who are maladjusted often appear to be insensitive to the needs of others. They as I mentioned, they have no internalized regret for negative actions toward others. And this goes to this is very reminiscent of sociopathic or psychopathic behavior, frankly. Students are manipulative. They can appear to be very, very street smart and very intentional and why they do what they do. And they often gravitate toward other types of dangerous students, other types of dangerous actions, if you will. And they're not afraid to cause distress on their victims. So they're often bullies, in other words. So social maladjustment is a persistent pattern of this. They violate social norms. They have often multiple acts of truancy, substance, sex abuse. They have a strong struggle with authority. They have a low frustration threshold. In other words, they're easily agitated and easily frustrated. They're extremely impulsive, and they have very strong manipulative behaviors. So again, EBD does not include this at the moment, and I think maybe that might change in coming years, but right now social maladjustment does not qualify for the category of emotional behavior disorder. So then what is EBD again? Going back to, it's that behavior on two dimensions that falls outside of the norms of culture, outside of the norms of that typically developing age group. They have externalizing versus internalizing behavior. Those are the two dimensions that we are talking about. So your externalizing behavior is what it sounds like. It's things that you're going to see on the outside. You can't miss it. It doesn't go undetected or unnoticed, if you will. So those who externalize their difficulties are called behavior disorders. These are, you're lying, you're stealing, you're fighting, you're yelling, you're ignoring, your temper tantrums, non-compliance. Whereas the internal disorders then are more considered emotional disorders. So these are your unhealthy anxieties, your learned helplessness, depression, phobias, things like that. So EBD covers a wide swath of psychological disorders. It covers these things. It's definitely not limited to the following. So things like bipolar disorder, or it could also be called manic depression. And yes, children are diagnosed on a regular basis with bipolar and or manic depression. Conduct disorders. These are disorders that go against the law, okay? Eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, things like that. Obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. Psychotic disorders, schizophrenia, personality disorders, borderline personality disorders, so on and so forth. These also include things like oppositional defiance disorder, which you probably will interact with on a regular basis in your classrooms, and reactive attachment disorder. Oppositional defiance disorder basically is a disorder where the child is in opposition to authority with everything, very externally so. Reactive attachment disorder is a disorder that is often seen in children who did not attach healthily to a caregiver in the first couple of years of their lives, and so they have attachment issues. So what happens is they will often easily attach to a trusted adult, and they will almost smother that adult and leech onto that adult, and then and honestly it's usually something that you can't figure out. It's unprecedented, and they will then react in a very negative way, in a very resistant way, and they will now resist that adult in a very negative, usually external, and usually very physically violent way. So EBD covers all of these things. It can be on either dimension, external or internal. You're going to see both in the classroom. So if you go back to Jim and Molly, Jim has the external sided emotional behavior disorder, but I would also contend that he is, with his crying on the school bus, he also has some components of the internalizing disorder. Whereas Molly is exhibiting more of the internalizing disorder, although I would also contend that she has some externalizing problems with her non-compliance issues. So what do these children look like as far as the characteristics of EBD? Remember those characteristics come into play, the external versus the internal, for a long duration, relatively speaking here. So when you compare them to other typically developing peers, and also the intensity of the behavior is strong when you compare them to their peers. And also with that intensity component is the idea that these externalizing or internalizing behaviors must occur in at least 2 dissimilar settings. So it can't just be happening at school and not happening at home, can't just be happening at home and not happening at school. It has to be kind of across the board here. Academically speaking, what do kids with emotional behavior disorder look like? Most children with emotional behavior disorder do have IQs that would be in the lower average range, so sub-average IQ is where I would kind of place them. They often have a concurrent learning disability alongside of EBD. So they'll be diagnosed with an EBD and they will have a learning disability. Maybe it's a reading or a math or a writing or spelling disorder that goes alongside of it. Okay. Most students with EBD, they have the lowest GPA of any disability. So the EBD component is, academically speaking, an issue. When you look at the statistics, children with EBD struggle across the board, academically speaking, which is why most of them have a concurrent learning disability. They often are performing 1 or more years below grade level, and highest absenteeism. Over 50% of kids with EBD drop out of school. Another kind of interesting statistic is EBD has the highest percentage of kids who are homeless. So think about some of those traumatic environments here. These traumatic issues. Some of these kids are really dealing with serious issues environmentally speaking, and it would make sense as to why they are struggling academically speaking and emotionally. Statistics looking at this, between 5 and 15% of children have some form of EBD. Again, these estimates vary. Why is there such a disparity with between 5 and 15%? That's a big jump. Well, remember, the subjective nature of the definition makes it really, really difficult to get accurate numbers across the board. It is known that the number of children that are receiving special education services for emotional behavior disorder is about 1% of children across the board. So just be aware of that. The wide range here, as I mentioned, is a subjective nature. Studies show that children who are highly aggressive as young children, so early childhood, here you early childhood teachers, this is where it's really important for you. If you've got kids who are highly aggressive in those early childhood years, they are more likely to continue to be at risk for poor academic, poor social outcomes as they continue to develop and age. Actually, one longitudinal study, so they did a really long study on children, they found that almost 3/4 of the children in the study identified as highly aggressive or even moderately aggressive as little children were then arrested as juveniles, and then half of those were arrested as adults. So this really suggests that early intervention with these external and internalizing behaviors is really key in helping to prevent lifelong problems that might stem from EBD.